Hello, YouTube. Reise nach Batavia is an illustrated manuscript by Georg Franz Müller, an Alsatian world traveler, describing his voyage to South Africa and Indonesia and his stay there in the years 1669 through 1682 in the services of the Dutch East India Company. Although little is known about this work, there are mentions in the manuscript that Müller, the recruited German gunsmith, was on board of ships transporting exotic creatures in cages back to Holland. So he definitely had access to samples of such creatures. The illustrated manuscript is where Georg Franz Müller described episodes from his journey to the Dutch East Indies in pictures and related verses. He described the animals, people, and the plants of East India and South Africa. The work has been kept in the Abbey Library of St. Gallen since the year of 1723. These unusual illustrations are taken from one of the two journals kept by this German recruit. Georg Franz Müller, he was Alsatian, means he was actually German, and he was a gunsmith who enlisted as a midshipman aboard the Dutch East India Company ships that sailed between Europe and Batavia in Indonesia between the years I mentioned above. Well, in October of 1669, the voyage to the East Indies began on the ship Gouda. Including a 2-month stay, Georg Franz Müller and other travelers spent a total of 334 days on the road to get from the Netherlands to the East Indies, which was above the average at the time. And, well, this was due to the problem with the winds they had in the Atlantic at the time. Already west of Gibraltar, the ship was attacked by 2 Turkish ships, resulting in 28 dead and 46 injured. The next destination was the Brazilian island of Fernando, from where they tried to reach South Africa. Some sailors and passengers were thrown over deck during storms and drowned. However, diseases were even more feared than storms. Scurvy, for example, was a common ship's disease, and even the Gouda was not spared from it. Another big problem was the lack of clean drinking water. They tried to collect the rainwater in the sails and other clothes in order to have enough to survive. There was an acute shortage of water. Georg Franz Müller wrote this, "And although this water is so miserable, it has tasted so good to me as the best Malvasia," referring to the wine, if I'm not mistaken. The travelers were also troubled by the icy cold caused by the Antarctic winds. When it got warmer again in the Indian Ocean, the winter clothes were thrown overboard as they were full of lice. Between the Cape Verde Islands and Fernando, the opposite problem plagued them, the heat. Müller describes long periods of heat and sunburns. Due to the lack of wind, the ship almost did not move at all. The first stop was the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. They reached this after half a year on the sea. And that's where Müller stayed for almost 2 months. On August 26, 1670, the ship finally reaches the island of Java. He was hired to guard the main Dutch fortress in Batavia. During this time, Müller got to know the Malay language, the country, and the people. Malay was the main language in the East Asia at the time. Many different ethnicities lived in Batavia, today's Jakarta, including Indians, Persians, Chinese, Formosans, or the Taiwanese, the Malays, Thai people, and of course the Javanese. Müller presents all this in verse form in his book In total, Georg Franz Müller stayed on Java and other Indonesian islands for almost 12 years. Basically, from September 1670 to January 1682, the period is interesting. This was the height of the piracy and European wars, of course, in France and so forth. But the people were expanding through the planet, Europeans exploring it, especially active, like Dutch East Indies Company, very active in the exploration of the planet, differently than some other empires, but nevertheless, they did what they wanted to do. He was a member of the Dutch aid contingent supporting distressed Dutch troops. Georg Franz Müller also reports that he was asked by the local to eat human flesh, but he refused. In 1682, he was seized by the desire to return to Europe again and give up his service in the East Indian Dutch Company. He traveled back to Amsterdam via South Africa on the ship named Africa. Within 10 months it took him. In 1683, he went on a pilgrimage to Rome and returned to his hometown in Rufach in the spring of 1684. His parents had already passed away, and when Müller made himself known, everyone wanted to admire the rarities from the East Indies. So he took some things with him as well. Sometime between 1684 and 1698, he entered the service of Columban von Adlau in Rorschach as a body servant. In July 1720, he returned to Rufach. He left a large part of his rarities behind. And Georg Franz Müller died in July of 1723. So somebody in Holland has his collection, or had it. There are a total of 87 illustrations, all of which were drawn by Georg Franz Müller. On this, you can see both people and animals, plants and landscapes, ships and maps. You can find people from different regions that he had visited. Again, these are always subtitled, so you can see from which region the depicted people, animals, or plants come, or what kind they are. However, events, they're also presented. And, it's possible to see ships and a tower with a Dutch flag and people fighting against each other. Georg Franz Müller described the respective animals, people, etc., again, in prose and in verse form, writing poems. Müller wrote factual descriptions, but also sometimes added his personal comments and experiences. What had he observed in the faraway lands that we do not know? Imagine he was observing that strange underwater creature you can see in the illustrations. Where was this creature and others transported to? Well, we know the Holland, but who received them in Holland? And what was done with them? Did they survive? I have some ideas. I have already presented my information about the Indonesian underwater humanoids, but you see, the Southwest Africa has its own legend, so to say, and very interesting sightings and encounters, and I have talked about them in my Namibia videos, but we are not sure where exactly the underwater creature came from, but it's obviously, it's logical that it would have to come from Indonesia. But since we're on the subject of Indonesia, let me tell you about some very unusual lakes in that country. In distant Indonesia, in the area of Kelimutu volcano, there are 3 mysterious and amazing lakes. They are of different colors and each has its own legend. These mystical stories, in which the locals unconditionally believe, are chilling and at the same time make colored reservoirs even more attractive to tourists because everyone wants to solve the mystery of the famous 3 lakes. But scientists are more interested in the amazing composition of these reservoirs. The crater lakes of the Kelimutu volcano, located on the Indonesian island of Flores, were formed, according to scientists, in 1968. during the last volcanic eruption. The depressions formed after the lava cooled gradually, filled with rainwater. Since then, they have been constantly replenished because of the rainy season lasts here for about 5 months a year, from the late autumn to early spring. However, there's another hypothesis about the age of the lakes, according to which they are much older. The thing is that the local ancient tribe mentioned colored reservoirs in this area many centuries ago, as evidenced by folk legends. Lakes are really not to be confused with any others. They are unique in that they periodically change their color, from azure to gray, then from marsh to brown, and so on. The color can also be red, almost white, and even black. And Mount Kelimutu is considered the only one in the world where you can see 3 adjacent lakes with periodically changing water color. Even more beautiful and mysterious is the haze periodically hovering over the lakes. It's amazing color, I was told by people who had seen it. Very interestingly, it is impossible to predict what the lake will be like when you climb to the Kelimutu volcano. The water may remain the same color for many more weeks, or it may suddenly change. The tourist only has the opportunity to see what colors these lakes had before in recent years. The data is monitored and the relevant information is posted near the reservoirs. Locals consider them to be sacred. The Aborigines associate the change in the color of the lakes with certain perturbations. In other worlds, where souls, in their opinion, languish in these water-filled bowls. The local population believes in the story told by grandparents and great-grandparents to them. They say that the souls of the deceased old people live in the first lake, in the second, the souls of those who died young, and in the third, the souls of the sinners. There's another account of this legend. According to it, in one lake, the souls of sorcerers languish, in another, sinful people, and in the third, babies, virgins, and those who lived righteously. Some residents of the island believe that the reservoirs are able to predict the future. Like if the lake has changed color, you should expect serious trouble for Flores and maybe for all the islands of Indonesia. Therefore, the longer the reservoir remains the same color, the better. According to the beliefs of an ancient local tribe, the lakes of this volcano are sacred and untouchable. This always transmitted to tourists, thanks to which an indescribable feeling of belonging to something important and mysterious covers them near these reservoirs. Scientists explain the reason for the multicolored lakes in their own way, exclusively from the point of view of science. According to them, it's all about chemical reactions occurring at the bottom of reservoirs at one time or another, and from weather conditions. In particular, the color can be impacted by volcanic gases entering the water from the bowels of the earth through cracks at the bottom of reservoirs. They react with minerals, the balance of which in lakes is constantly changing. For example, a bright green color is formed when sulfuric and hydrochloric acids are mixed, and red, iron with hydrogen sulfide. By the way, you cannot touch the water with your hand. The surface of the water is much lower than the edges of the lakes. There were cases when people tried to climb down from the steep banks, but such attempts ended tragically. So admire them from afar. Indonesia is a country definitely worth visiting for those who also like paranormal phenomena. And there's much more that I'll be telling about this land in my future videos as well, not only about Eurasia, Russia, Ukraine, Siberia, Central Asia, the Arctic, but also places like that are of great interest to me, just like is Southern Africa and Southwest Africa. And so I want to let you know that the investigation into the enigmatic underwater humanoids and civilizations that exist below the ocean seas and lakes continues. With the, with means available to me, I still am very much interested in this. And many of you have heard about my book written with Philip Mantle together. It's called Russia's USO Secrets. And you can also look at my videos and see my current and ongoing research as well. And if you can support my research, you'll find the description. You'll find how to do it in the description to this video. And I'll bring you more videos from different subjects as well, which should be described as paranormal Eurasia, but also, like I said, other areas of the world. I want to thank you for your attention to my work and hope to present more videos soon.